Hello, I'm Dr. Vamsi Velcheti, your guest host for the ASCO Daily News Podcast today. I'm a professor of medicine and director of thoracic oncology at the Perlmutter Cancer Center at NYU Langone. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the impact of shortage of cancer chemotherapy drugs across the United States. This has been affecting several thousands of patients with adult and pediatric cancers and hampering enrollment in clinical trials. Among the shortages are very commonly used drugs like cisplatin, carboplatin, methotrexate, fludarabine, and some of these shortages have persisted since the time of the pandemic in 2020. So today, to discuss this really troubling scenario, I have two outstanding colleagues, Dr. Janakiraman Subramanian, the Director of Thoracic Oncology at Innova's Cancer Institute in Virginia, and Dr. Taofeek Owonikoko, a professor of medicine and the chief of Division of Hematology and Oncology at the University of Pittsburgh Hillman Cancer Center. Our full disclosures are available in the transcript of this episode. Thank you both, Dr. Owonikoko and Dr. Subramanian, for your time today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So a recent survey by the NCCN found that 90% of the nation's largest cancer centers have experienced a shortage in carboplatin, and 70% of the centers have reported shortage in cisplatin. These are platinum-based chemotherapies that we use frequently in patients with cancer. And often these are curative intent treatments for several cancers. And these are used in several tumor types, solid tumors, and hematologic malignancy. So the scale of the problem is immense. Dr. Owonikoko, I'd like to hear from you on your take on the situation and how are you dealing with this at the UPMC Cancer Center?
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Velcheti, and I'm happy to be part of this panel. As you rightly surmised, that chemotherapy drug shortage is what we've all experienced across the length and breadth of the United States. Our cancer center here in Pittsburgh, not an exception. We've had to be proactive as well as think outside the box to be able to manage the challenge. Just like every other cancer center across the country, maybe to varying degrees, we've had to look at patients in need of chemotherapy with this standard of care agents such as cisplatin or carboplatin, and to some degree docetaxel during this past episode of drug shortage that we all went through. And while we did not have to, fortunately, cancel any patient's treatment, we all went through that with bated breath, not sure of where the next batch of chemotherapy drug will come through. But I would say in the past couple of weeks, we've actually seen some improvement in drug availability. But before then, we had to have contingency plans where on a weekly basis, we review our patient list and the drug regimen that they're going to need, and had to make sure that we had enough drug on hand for those patients. And in situations where we thought we might not have enough drug, we also had the plan to use alternative regimen. But everything we did, we were proactive in having guiding principles that are consistent with, ASCO's recommendations in terms of quality care delivery for cancer patients. So I'm sure that this is more or less the same approach adopted by other leading cancer centers across the country.
Thank you, Dr. Owonikoko. And Dr. Subramanian, you're in a community setting, a large cancer center that serves a lot of patients in the state of Virginia. So what is the scale of the problem at your institution and how are you handling it?
First of all, Dr. Velcheti, thanks for having me here on this panel. And as you rightly said, this is a significant problem and it is across the country, like Dr. Owonikoko said. And as medical oncologists, we are not always thinking of drug shortages. Our focus is on taking care of our patients. So this is one more issue that we need to keep in mind now as we manage our patients with cancer. When this shortage started, the biggest problem, as you know, was when we became aware of this was primarily in cisplatin. And we had some of our patients who were getting curative treatment, and we had to make a decision on, can they get cisplatin or can they get carboplatin? And one of the things we did was to have a ethics committee that will review each patient that is being planned to receive cisplatin-based chemotherapy and come to a decision on how best we can support them. The template for some of this was based upon some of the triage mechanisms we used during COVID, as well as the ASCO guideline document for managing this chemotherapy shortage was one of the blueprints we used. And they have reviewed all cases, all patients that are being planned for cisplatin or carboplatin for that matter. And we come to a decision based on that. And we also have another committee that constantly monitors drug availability on a weekly basis and tries to forecast where the next problem would be as we take care of our patients. And particularly as a lung cancer doctor, we've had situations where we had to use carboplatin instead of cisplatin. And even we also have carboplatin shortage. And so the committee usually approves 2 cycles at a time. But thankfully, so far, we have not had a situation where we could not offer our patients the chemotherapy treatment. But we are very carefully monitoring the situation, hoping that this will improve. The other aspect, a shortage has been in 5-FU. A lot of our GI colleagues, as well as I treat esophageal cancer patients as well, where we've had to forego the bolus 5-FU and have a 10% reduction on all 5-FU infusions. And we've been using some of those reductions to ensure that we can have 5-FU available for all our patients. And that's how we've been trying to manage this shortage situation here at InnovaShore.
So, Dr. Subramanian and Dr. Owonikoko, we are oncologists, we are treating patients. And, the toughest part really is telling a patient that, we don't have access to certain drugs and we have to switch treatments to perhaps another treatment regimen that may be suboptimal. And it's always a very anxiety-provoking discussion, and especially for patients with metastatic cancer. They're already under a lot of stress, and it's a really difficult conversation. How do you handle that, Dr. Owonikoko?
That's a conversation we all hope we don't have to have. And fortunately, with this current crisis, I've actually not had such a misfortune of having to inform a patient that we don't have drugs to treat them or that we have to switch to something inferior. But conceptually, it's possible that could have happened, and that would have been very, very difficult. But the one thing that we did, though, as part of our mitigation strategy was actually to inform patient ahead of time, because the way we handled this was to look at our inventory on a week-by-week basis. And if there are patients where we felt maybe they will be coming in towards the end of the week and we may not have enough drug for them, to let them know the possibility exists that we might have to switch them to something different. While we did not have to do that for any patient, yes, there are patients that we had to give that heads up to say, we're having this shortage, we're doing everything we can to make sure it's available, but just in case it's not available, I think what is most important for most patients is to be aware of that decision ahead of time, to be able to process it, and to be transparent. The other challenge that we faced was, if you have to choose between patients, what should be your guiding principles as to who gets the drug and who doesn't get it? I think it's very easy for all of us to say, if it's curative intent, we do it. If it's not curative intent, we don't do it. It's a little more complicated than that, because if we put the equity hat on, curative intent doesn't necessarily mean that life is more valuable than somebody who cannot be cured. And this is where really, I think, having people with expertise in ethics of care delivery and disaster management will be very, very important for us to proactively anticipate that should this become a recurrent problem in the future, that we actually have a well-vetted approach, just like we did during COVID, where you have to ration, resources, that we have those people with expertise to help us as oncologists, because not all of us, at least personally, I can speak for myself, that is not my area of expertise and comfort.
Excellent points. Dr. Subramanian, anything to add?
Oh, absolutely. I echo what Dr. Owonikoko said. These are conversations that we would like to hopefully never have with our patients, but this is a crisis that we are facing now. And personally, I can tell you like 2 situations where we ran into this problem. But overall, though, we never had to stop a treatment or cancel a treatment for our patient. In the first situation, we had a young man with a rare germ cell tumor at the hospital for whom cisplatin was key. And he was already in the ICU, and sometimes the treatment start dates are not perfect, unlike what we do in the outpatient setting, depending on how well he's doing, or, the treatment start dates might move by a day or so. So we basically had to hold a certain dose of cisplatin for him. This brings the next question, which is how do we decide who gets cisplatin versus who can go for an alternative option? And I think Dr. Owonikoko made a great point where just because it is curative disease does not mean their life is more valuable. This is where I think trying to make that decision at an individual level as a individual treating physician can be extremely hard. And that's why at our institution, we have this ethics committee where we have oncologists, pharmacists, and ethicists that review these chemotherapy orders, particularly for cisplatin, and try to use some guiding principles that we learned from COVID, as well as ASCO's guidance to decide how we, assign our resources. That's one option, one way we have done. And then in another situation that was faced by one of my GI oncology colleague was a patient that was originally planned to go on a clinical trial where the chemotherapy backbone was FOLFOX. And because that we had the 5FU shortage, we could not offer that patient clinical trial enrollment. And that was a tough conversation where they had to tell them that they could not go on a clinical trial that they were looking forward to. And this then brings the next question, which is by foregoing the bolus 5FU and by the 10% reduction in the infusional 5FU, are we providing them inferior treatment? And it's a conversation that's had at a very individual level. I don't envy my colleague who had to have that conversation. It's a challenge, and we try to do our best to communicate to our patients that we are trying to provide care without trying to compromise the effectiveness of treatment for them.
Thank you so much, both of you. And we had the same issues here at NYU in New York City as well. It appears like, the degree of shortage and the drugs that are in shortage has been somewhat different at different locations across the United States. But the theme has been that we are having to ration treatments for our patients. And of course, there are some tumor types where there's really no adequate substitution. Like, for example, GU cancers. I mean, you can't really not give them cisplatin. A lot of these are situations which are curative intent and young patients. So it's really troubling. And I think one of the things that really came out of this is, there's been a lot of push from professional societies that actually ASCO has been spearheading, and some intense discussions with CMS and legislators to kind of provide more long-term fix for these things. And I think all of us have to be more engaged in those discussions with our professional societies like ASCO to kind of help promote awareness. I know both of you are at large cancer centers that enroll patients on clinical trials. Of course, these drugs, especially carboplatin for lung cancer, especially, these are like core treatments that are used in managing cancer patients with lung cancer. So how is this affecting your clinical trial accrual? Are you prioritizing patients on clinical trial for these drugs? Have you had to make any decisions to hold clinical trial accrual for certain trials? Kind of curious to hear.
Yeah, so I can maybe weigh in a little bit on that in terms of what we've had to do for patients receiving treatment as standard of care versus those going on clinical trials. As we all recognize that when patient goes on clinical trial, even if they're going to receive standard of care regimen as part of that trial, it still has to be administered in line with the protocol. So during the extreme period of shortage anxiety, we actually had consideration for perhaps not putting patient on trial if we're not sure that they will be able to continue to receive the protocol-mandated treatment, whether as control intervention or the experimental intervention. The good thing to come out of this is we, at least here at UPMC, we actually did not have any instance where we had to deny a patient clinical trial participation, but there were anxious periods when we already had patient enrolled and they were scheduled to receive platinum-containing regimen, and we were not sure whether or not we're going to have adequate supply of the drug for them while on trial. I think this really raises an important consideration going forward as we come out of this current shortage. I don't, by any stretch of imagination, assume that this is going to be the last one we experience. But I think the lessons learned here, we have to also carry that forward, both in the design of trial as well as in the regulatory environment surrounding clinical trial conduct. To say, should another incidence of drug shortage were to happen, how do we actually operationalize that with respect to patient on trial, whether starting or already on trial? I think it's much more challenging when the patient is already on the trial. They've already started. It's less challenging if you just have to make a decision about somebody starting newly on the trial. But equally important is that by not allowing new patients to go on trial is denying something that potentially could be of benefit to them, albeit it's still a trial, is not an established treatment option yet.
I completely agree with Dr. Owonikoko. Those were very key points and issues that we face as well. In terms of my patients with lung cancer, we haven't had a problem in getting them on clinical trials, even though we have had carboplatin shortage. Patients who are already on treatment, they were able to get their carboplatin. For new patients, we were still able to provide them carboplatin as well. The biggest problem for clinical trials has been primarily with my GI colleagues who have to use 5-FU. And there, as I said before, we are unable to give bolus 5-FU, and there is a 10% reduction with the infusional 5-FU. So we can't have any of these patients go on clinical trials. And as a result, that's anything that has to do with 5-FU has come to a screeching halt in terms of clinical trials for our patients. And I think I echo the point of Dr. Owonikoko that by no means this is the last drug shortage we're going to be dealing with. And we are here today discussing this also because this shortage has not ended. It's been ongoing. It's one of the longest drug shortages in my memory as a medical oncologist. And that's concerning. We still see that there is some improvement, but we haven't gotten past it yet. And therefore, as we develop clinical trials, and we need to have methods to address drug shortages and how we manage patient enrollment, as well as how do we manage existing patients who are already on a clinical trial, and if possible, what might be their options in that situation. At least it is something we may not have all the answers, but it is definitely an issue that we need to think about in the future as we develop and implement newer clinical trials for our patients.
I completely agree, and great points, both of you. And we've had the same issues with clinical trials at NYU Langone as well due to the shortage. It's been a challenge, and I think this is a problem that's so complex because of supply chain issues and the way the drugs are priced, and incentives for manufacturing these drugs in the United States is not lucrative enough to actually onshore a lot of the production of these drugs. So I think, at the end of the day, I think we have to come up with some creative, innovative reimbursement structures for these generic chemotherapy drugs. And I think this would require like a very complex economic solution that perhaps ASCO and other organizations should kind of like really kind of foster like an environment of innovation to kind of help facilitate onshoring some of the manufacturing of these key drugs within the United States. I think ASCO is already trying to do that, trying to collaborate with all the stakeholders to kind of address this problem. It's very critical. And I think all of us have to be engaged in some of the advocacy efforts that are ongoing to kind of address these drug shortages. And this is not a short-term problem. Dr. Owonikoko and Dr. Subramanian, any final thoughts before we wrap up the podcast today?
So, Vamsi, you mentioned the whole complex supply chain and the fact that we rely primarily on overseas manufacturers to get these drugs that are off patent, but still a key backbone of our cancer treatment. I think those are all key issues that policymakers, leaders in the field have to keep in mind. As an institution at Innova, one of the key mechanisms that have helped us to sort of stay ahead of the shortage was to have this inventory management team that monitors the inventory out there. And in fact, the inventory management team does have access to what the inventory is in some of their main suppliers in terms of the drugs. And they also have an idea of how many patients are going through treatment, what is the weekly usage of a specific drug like carboplatin, and they try to forecast what is coming down the road and try to prepare for it. And as we try to look for solutions, maybe a forecasting mechanism in a larger scale, like either spearheaded by ASCO or by policymakers level, that can, for the overall country, try to see where some of the inventory is for some of these critical drugs and try to prepare for it ahead of time, rather than wait till we hit the shortage and then try to find alternative suppliers to get the drug, which obviously doesn't happen quick enough. It takes months or even longer to catch up and get the inventory back to the level where we can comfortably take care of our patients. So I think that is something that we should be advocating for, that, as well as the professional societies definitely should take a handle on that and see if they can support something like that, as well as letting the institutions know ahead of time what's coming might be very helpful.
Yeah, and a very good point, Raman. And I think that's a key takeaway here. I think we have to learn from other industries and this is not unique to healthcare by any means, right? I mean, like these chronic shortages due to supply chain issues, inventory management, there might be some learnings from other industries here. Dr. Owonikoko, any closing thoughts?
Yeah, I agree as well with all the points made by Dr. Subramanian and yourself. This is a chronic problem, requires long-term strategy. I think it's both an economic problem as well as a regulatory problem. As we all know, part of the reason why we went through this current crisis is the regulatory decision by the FDA regarding safety of one of the manufacturers. So, being proactive in terms of how these audits are conducted and giving people, lead time, I think will help avoid similar situations in the future. It's an economic problem. There's a reason why a lot of the big pharma companies are not producing these drugs. And if the cost of production is such that the amount of money you get paid is enough to cover your price, I think there is an economic issue there to be addressed. That is unfortunately not within the scope of what any one of us can do individually, but as advocates in terms of the structure of incentivizing new drug versus old drug. Some of these newer drugs are quite expensive, but oftentimes they're used along with standard drugs that are not as expensive. So where do we strike that balance? Where we do not stifle innovation, but at the same time, we don't create a perverse incentive system where everybody just wants to come up with the newest, most expensive drug and nobody is interested in really producing the backbone chemotherapy and other agents that will make those new drugs work well. So I think we have to pay attention. We have to advocate for our patients through our different institutions and organizations. And I hope that society as a whole, that we've learned a lot of lessons from this crisis and that will help us craft some long-term strategies.
Thank you both, Dr. Owonikoko and Dr. Subramanian, for your time today to speak with me and for sharing your insights with us on the ASCO Daily News Podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thank you to our listeners for your time today. If you value the insights that you hear on ASCO Daily News Podcast, please take a moment to rate, review, and subscribe wherever you get your podcast. Thank you so much.
The purpose of this podcast is to educate and to inform. This is not a substitute for professional medical care and is not intended for use in the diagnosis or treatment of individual conditions. Guests on this podcast express their own opinions, experience, and conclusions. Guest statements on the podcast do not express the opinions of ASCO. The mention of any product, service, organization, activity, or therapy should not be construed as an ASCO endorsement.